Now, I'd quite like to try and turn to, to what you see as the positives. So if we've just done everything that's going wrong, I think we can now do the bit where we start to say, well, these are the ways that things can start going right. So firstly, what are you trying to do as a defence economist to help sort out the UK's defence market?
Let me just try to pick my way through it. Governments are central to understanding defence. They are major providers, in some cases, the only providers of defence. And that is a problem in terms of how do we get a competitive market when we only have one buyer? We haven't got competition on the buying side. We can have competition on the supply side. We can have lots of suppliers bidding, competing to provide some sort of defence, whatever it might be. So governments are central to understanding defence and defence economics. But nonetheless, we can introduce some competition, some rivalry into what otherwise appear to be non-competitive type markets. So we could have firms bidding for a defence contract, and governments decide how many firms can bid or whether firms do bid for defence contracts. So you're right that they're still there and they are trying to stop markets working. I think people have to be aware that markets are available and can work in defence, even though governments say not. So, for example, we used to have a lot of private finance initiatives, and the government doesn't use them now, but that's a government decision. They could use private finance initiatives whereby the private sector provides services to defence and in return for which he gets a payment. And so it pays for those services. And the services range from routine things like firing ranges, like accommodation. You can provide accommodation, and that can be provided by private firms who provide it to the governments for a fee, for a rent. We do actually have other examples of private finance initiatives which move towards the front line. For example, air tankers, air refueling tankers. Whilst a private provided, government funds them and pays for them, but it sets up the competition in the first place so that we can get some competition on the supply side. But we've still got the problem of not having competition on the buying side. And my task is to try to think about, expand, explore the opportunities for introducing some competition to markets which traditionally appear non-competitive.
Okay, so from this perspective of wanting to get more competition into the market, what do you see as the ways that that could be done? Because we think back to the very start of this episode, is we laid out defence markets. We face this issue of there being one buyer, and that's the state. So were we limited now in the ways that we can actually get competition in?
Okay, well, I three thoughts on how we can improve things. First of all, we need to get our relationship with Europe sorted out. Europe at the moment is not having the UK as a defence partner, and I think that's a great mistake. There's nothing I can do about it. The Europeans do not seem to want Britain as a partner, but they can't afford to neglect Britain. We are one of the largest defence spenders in Europe, and we're moving to a situation where we need to come together and focus on collective defence, which I think can offer much better value for money. For example, if we had a genuine European market in defence, we would look at anti-missile defence. There would be a possibility for a larger Europe providing anti-ballistic defence. At the moment, we don't, but we could. Where else could we go? We could improve things. I think we could improve by having more reserves, by having a reserve air force, a reserve navy, as well as a reserve army. We've never had, in recent years, a reserve air force and a reserve navy. We used to, a long time ago, but other nations do quite well with their reserve air forces. The Israelis have a reserve air force. The Americans have a reserve air force. I think we should have one. And I think we should expand the role of reservists. And then I come back to the incentives facing individuals. We need to actually look at the incentive structure available to individuals in the armed forces and see if we can replicate a system which provides efficiency in private markets and see if we can convert and translate those efficiency incentives into the military and the armed forces. For example, I think there's much more scope for restoring private finance initiatives and going back to having the private sector providing defence services and even going up towards the front line. We can speculate about having mercenaries, for example, in the front line. I know it causes eyebrows to raise, but logically it's a possibility. The problem, the objection against it is that as mercenaries, they might always be recontracting and they might move. You can't trust them. But then you can't always trust public provided armies. They mutiny, they desert, and they run away in conflict. So it isn't as though you've got a one-sided argument. There are opportunities for applying market principles in defence. And I think there'll be tremendous savings to be had. I think, for example, the principle of substitution. I would want to explore and expand on that. For example, women replacing men in the armed forces, reserves replacing regulars, helicopters replacing tanks.
So for our listeners, because I was taking notes as you were giving that answer, Professor Hartley, and the big three arguments were if we connect again with Europe to share the costs between partner nations, we can also have multiple states increasing the buyer side competition. And then you mentioned reserve forces to allow the principle of substitution. And all my high school economics classes are now coming back to me in flashes of memory, and I'm not happy about it. But principle of substitution is if you have a cheaper but of equally desirable quality product that you can switch in when the price of your first choice good rises. So essentially the price of the regulars becomes too high. If we have reserves, we can start using the reserves more, make more use of them. It's a lower cost alternative, but there's still that training, there's still that quality. You know, I'll attach some links to relevant economic principles in the description. It'll do a better job than I am at explaining all this. And then finally, the use of PFIs. So public funding to a private company to provide a service. Have you seen any signs that some of the ideas you mention here and that you've advocated for are already coming into play in defence market reforms, specifically UK defence market reforms?
Yeah, there are certain things, and you have started to move in that direction, where only the state can provide them. The very high risk activities, which might otherwise be horrendously expensive, but still the state has to pay. Because they're expensive, doesn't it? In fact, you won't get anyone else to do them. The state will have to do those activities. No, I was actually more limited. The British, as far as I understand it, MOD has decided not to pursue any more PFIs. Now, I might be wrong on that, but if that's the case, I'm arguing for more PFIs, that they should go back and start the policy again. It's all too easy for the military to argue, oh, the private sector doesn't provide this and won't do these things. There are two things. One, why won't it do them? And it might well be that the military is specifying the contract in such a way as to make it impossible or unattractive to the private sector. It doesn't follow that the private sector is at fault if it's not providing certain activities. It might well be that the set of incentives, and back to incentives again, the set of incentives are such that by slightly tweaking them, by slightly rearranging them, or in fact radically rearranging them, the private sector might be willing to enter the market. So I'd like to see more PFI.
On that last point, don't you think that perhaps before we can say cash is king and people will do nasty jobs for money, that war and the act of war is too bloody for firms to enter that space, and that we already have enough supply-side competition to make these incentives work, to have those improvements in the UK defence market, and actually we don't need to just keep adding more competition all the way to the front line?
Yeah, so I'd like to see more PFIs. Now, as we move towards the front line, that is typically the area where it might be difficult to have the private sector involved. The risks become higher, and it becomes difficult for the private sector or anyone else to write and enforce a contract. Let's think of the Korean War. You can actually have private contractors bidding to provide armed forces in the Korean War, or even any other war. They'll do that But what we can't anticipate is the whole set of risks involved in some of these military activities. So you contract with South Korea and with the Americans that you'll provide an army to fight in South Korea and to fight the North Koreans over the period 1950 to 53. What you can't anticipate is China coming in, and suddenly you've got to recontract. And that is, I think, the area where the private sector has limitations. Understandably, they don't want to go to war. So I think there are certain activities where it is very difficult, very costly to write and enforce a contract. And you leave it to the state to bear those risks. But of course, the state can't, it's not doing it cheaply. The state has to pay the price of assuming those risks.